Happy to have folks here. Good afternoon and welcome to today's Roundtable held in conjunction with the exhibition Juana Valdes, Rest Ashore. I'm Lori Mertes. Hi, Lilia Garcia, Executive Director at Locust Projects, and I'm honored to have this esteemed group of speakers bringing their expertise to topics relevant to our current moment. Among them, the 1980s is a pivotal turning point in creating the Miami we know today, the racial politics of immigration in Latinidad, and the growing Latinx movement, which I don't know if anyone was tuning into NPR this morning. There was a very heated discussion about the term Latinx that was really dealing with cross-generational discussions and issues, which I thought was very interesting and sort of shaping the conversation today. Monica Pena, who is our programs coordinator, is going to do the formal introductions, but I really want to send my warmest thanks to Juana, to Arlene, Donette, and also María Elena for being with us here today. Juana, I think you're on. I think I see you. Yeah. It has been such a great honor to work with you and help you realize Rest Ashore. I cannot believe that it is ending this week. This is the last week to see the project. And I feel like, you know, we've been through months together through all of this. And I'm just so honored that we were here for you to help you shape your vision and make this project possible. That's really all I have. Juana, did you want me to say anything further before I turn it over to Monica? Because we want to hear from you all.
No, not at all. I just wanted to say I'm having withdrawals already. It's been such an incredible experience, and thank you so much for the support. I don't think it would have been possible without your support and everybody else at Locust Project. So I'm sending everyone my love. That's the only thing I want to say.
Love back to you, and thank you all so much for being here. We really appreciate it. Have a great program. Monica, it's over to you.
Lori, thank you.
Keeping it real.
For that warm welcome, Lori, and for joining us. And thank you all so much to everyone in the audience for being here. We know there's a lot going on. My name is Monica Pena, and I help coordinate Wavemaker grants and other programs at Locust Projects. For those of you who don't know us yet, Locust Projects is Miami's longest running nonprofit alternative art space. We create opportunities for artists at all career stages, invite risk-taking and experimentation, activate conversation around new art and ideas, which is, of course, why we're all gathered together here today. And we advocate for artists and artistic practices. We're thrilled to bring together this group of speakers around Juana's current exhibition at Locust Projects Rest Ashore. Juana is, of course, an artist and professor in the Department of Art at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. If you haven't yet, as Lori mentioned, be sure to check out her current exhibition at Locust Projects. It's on view through Saturday by appointment only. For more info on the show and to make an appointment, you can check out our website, locustprojects.org, or follow us on Instagram at Locust Projects to keep up with what we're up to if you're not following us already. Juana has very generously assembled a dynamic group of speakers who will be sharing their expertise and insight on a range of topics inspired by her work, a range of intersecting topics. Donette Francis is a professor of English and American Studies at the University of Miami. Recently, she published and curated a special journal issue looking for Black Miami in Anthurium, and she's currently working on a book-length project on Black Miami artists, which I personally am very excited about. Arlene Dávila is professor of Anthropology and American Studies at NYU and founding director of the Latinx Project. She is the author of 6 books focusing on Latinx cultural politics. And María Elena Ortiz is the curator at Pérez Art Museum right here in Miami, where she spearheads the Caribbean Cultural Institute. Her curatorial practice is informed by the connection between Latinx, Latin American, and Caribbean communities in the US. Thanks again so much to each of you for being here, making time for us, making time for each other, making time for conversation. Again, we're really excited to hear what you have to say about Juana's show and all the intersecting topics that it helps bring to the foreground. At the end of today's program, we will have some time to answer questions from the audience. So audience, I would like to point you to the Q&A box. If you hover towards the bottom of your Zoom window, you will see a Q&A icon. Go ahead and click that, and at any point during today's program, if you have a question, drop it in there, and we will try to get to as many of those questions as we can at the end of the program. So I think that's it for me. Without further ado, I'd like to turn things over to Juana.
Okay, Monica, thank you. And I want to thank everybody that's here. Let me know if anytime you're not hearing me well. I wanted to, I'm going to read because I want to stay exact in terms of the amount of time that I have. And there's so much I wanted to share and say, but I think that what the panelists have here to share with you, it's also going to be as dynamic and as important. So I want to express my gratitude to the different institutions that supported the new work and exhibition Locust projects. The first, Ulai Arts for the Ellie's Award, whose funding initiated the video works in the exhibition Sight Unseen, along with the Funding Arts Network for their support of artist exhibitions at Locust Project, the Lynn and Lewis Wolfson II Florida Moving Image Archives, the Cuban Heritage Collection at the University of Miami, the History Miami Museum, and the University of Massachusetts Amherst for their Research Henley Endowment Grant. I am really excited to be here today with a group of amazing, talented, and brilliant women who I consider powerhouses in their own field. I want to acknowledge our past collaboration, which in some cases extend over 8 years. When I moved back to Miami in 2010, William Cordova introduced me to María Elena Ortiz. Our meeting led to her participation in the panel Revisiting the Caribbean and Latin America, Contemporary Conversations on Visual Arts in 2015 at the University, the Florida Atlantic University, where I was an assistant professor at the time. Professors Donette Francis, I met during a series of studio visits, a part of the Diaspora Vibe Incubator, organized by Rosie Gordon Wallace. This eventually leads to an invitation for me to contribute an interview to her recently published journal issue, Looking for Black Miami in Anthurium, March of this year. Elia Alba, a New York-based artist, who I'm sure most of you may know, connected me with Professor Arlene Dávila, and we have had many conversations in New York and here in Miami while she worked on her current publication, Latinx Arts, Artists, Markets, and Politics, which lists my work. I bring attention to these connections because for artists who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color, these relations form a river, a tributaries that open up to reservoirs and sustain ecosystems that support, nourish, recognize, and decipher our works, often translating and contextualizing them for the mainstream contemporary art. Without these sort of ecosystem, it's hard to be an artist, especially an artist of color and contemporary in society today. So back to my own personal history. I was born in Pinar del Rio, Cuba. I came to the United States in 1971 as part of the Freedom Flights. I was one of 4 kids, ages 6 to 15. I grew up in what I consider old Miami of the 70s and 80s and moved to New York to complete my art education at Parsons School of Design and my MFA at the School of Visual Arts in the 90s. I returned to Miami in 2010 to teach at Florida Atlantic University. I share my bio because it connotes a pre-existing migration that exists in my genes, part of my DNA that combines African free slave labor with coolie labor from China in the Caribbean. It is a migration that today continues from the equator to the American South and ultimately El Norte, where I find myself now at the University of Massachusetts. The exhibition works do not address migration as a particular problem of a political unrest due to a dictatorship, the desire for economic prosperity or climate change. Instead, it ties it to the history of trade, globalization, formed under the ideology of colonialism and empires that have disadvantaged Indigenous and people of color worldwide, a byproduct of racial capitalism. The artworks serve as a platform to question the systematic oppressive structures, the coloniality of power at the intersection of race, class, labor, and gender. The invitation that I put forth for the conversations we're having here today, in which I asked them each of the panelists to examine how the works in the exhibition intersect their own creative research or not, and to allow the work to do what I always intended the work to be a platform in which we could all come and talk and discuss and arrive at a better future. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the first speaker.
Hi. So, yeah, so I believe that's me. I don't know if there's anything I need to do beyond start speaking. Yeah.
We're all set. We're waiting.
All right.
We're excited waiting.
Okay. So first I want to thank Monica Pena and other members of the Locust Project staff for all the behind the scenes coordination that made this conversation possible. In the interest of time, I want to talk about Juana's art practice in relationship to 2 points. One, the importance of 1980 and the long 1980s as a pivotal turning point in contemporary Miami, and Juana's work is exemplary of a Black Miami aesthetic that necessitates the triangulation of the Black, the Southern, and the hemispheric in order to grasp all the relevant geopolitical and cultural frames necessary to read the effect and affect of place among Black Miami artists. 1980 specifically, and the long 1980s more broadly, conjoins a number of significant events not often thought together. Rather than segregated social histories of particular ethnic populations, these relational and intersecting histories of racial, ethnic, and class politics are crucial to understanding Miami's complicated history as a Jim Crow Southern US city that is also the gateway to the Americas. The entangled events and the ensuing cultural wars of the long 1980s catalyzed Miami's acculturation into a Spanish-dominant bicultural city where the middle-class white Hispanic population normalized the idea and practice of what I call a cosmopolitan hemispheric Creole whiteness. As migrants of the hemisphere met up in this city without a long-standing Anglo-Saxon hegemony, a white Latinx, both largely and initially Cuban, toppled any exclusive Anglo-American hold on power by making claims to the city's political, economic, and cultural institutions. Subsequent generations of Haitian and English-speaking Black Caribbean immigrants have attempted to deploy this model, but have confronted how Blackness often limited institutional access and incorporation. These fault lines between white Latinness and Blackness, which includes the uncertain position of Black Latinos, illustrate how multiculturalism is operationalized differently in Miami than in other US cities. In other words, cosmopolitan hemispheric Creole whiteness is the operative logic of white supremacy in Miami, which understands itself as more worldly and less provincial than Anglo-American whiteness. Miami is the only US city where Spanish is a prestige language, and among Latinos, there is a subtle internal ranking where Cubans, especially of the earliest generations, and South Americans are on one end of the continuum, and Central Americans and Mexicans on the other. The Black community has its own internal hierarchies that often make sharp distinctions between African Americans, Bahamians, Jamaicans, and Haitians, or having roots in the US versus having roots elsewhere, where having the latter, roots elsewhere, is more valued, often with the exception of Haitians. This then is the sociocultural political context in which Juana produces art. There is a multiple consciousness at work in her art practice, what I call a Black Southern hemispheric imaginary that both accounts for and responds to Miami's complicated Creole context of racial, ethnic proximity, contestation, accommodation, and exclusion. Juana's practice has always been concerned with materiality and texture of porcelain, paper sails, handkerchief, and beadwork to tell the intimate and affective histories of globalization, colonization, and empire, particularly as it intersects with women's social and labor histories. What strikes me about this new project is Juana's search for a form to communicate the power of the immigrant story being told in the urgency of our political present that insists on thinking together anti-immigrant and anti-Black sentiments and politics. Juana centers waves of Cuban immigration into Miami, and subjects the history of her co-ethnics to scrutiny in an effort to make visible the very local and distinctive project of racialization and racial formation. If whiteness is a project, she demonstrates the systemic ways in which elite Latinos in Miami have been able to opt in. When viewers walk into the gallery space, they're immediately confronted with the subject heading of the wall text, History of Assistance for Cuban Immigrants, end quote, that reproduces a timeline from 1959 to 2014, charting legislative acts around Medicare, pathway to US residency, and supplemental security income, among others, attributed to or directed towards Cuban refugees. As a Black Cuban, what does it mean to both see and lay bare the exceptional refugee status of Cubans in the US? What does it mean to render visible how the geopolitics of the Cold War provide a pathway to citizenship? What does it mean to call her co-ethnics to Black empathy? These are the historic questions with resonances in our current moment that Juana's work provokes. I want to turn briefly to discuss the work itself. So Rest Ashore immediately transports us to the sea, prompting us to understand the sea as the shoreline, the sea and the shoreline is our discriminating border wall that interdicts and sends some migrants back home from the sea, or rescues and welcomes others to the US shores, recalling the history of differential reception of Haitian versus Cuban immigrants in South Florida. The title, Rest Ashore, is simultaneously an aspirational statement and a hesitating question of what awaits the immigrant on the other side of the shore where they seek refuge. This brilliant title also conjures the idiom, rest assured, that connotes the certainty that something will happen and is therefore used to make the hearer feel safe or less worried about the circumstances in front of them or those on the horizon. As such, Juana's work marries a temporal logic of futurity to a spatial one of immigrant risk, hope, and optimism that accompanies travel, movement, and diaspora. With the sonic waves of the sea, the 13-minute video opens at sunrise and ends at sunset. In all, it captures a day in the life of refugees as they seek to make the perilous journey, seeking safety on the other side of the Florida Strait. Think, for example, of the opening aerial shot of the empty seashore juxtaposed with the closing aerial shot of the personal effects washed ashore and the implicit bodies lost at sea. The viewer is simultaneously put inside the position of surveillance and immersion. Large industrial wooden pallets used to ship cargo become the bleachers that viewers sit on in order to watch the triptych. This positionality is meant to produce the effective and hopefully empathetic response. What were the circumstances that led individuals and families with children to leave their homes behind and seek refuge elsewhere? And what must it feel like to be adrift at sea? Viewers are 3 minutes into the video before we see the first object afloat, which is then followed by a litter of other personal effects: book bags, suitcases, a teddy bear, a soccer ball, and the life vest that didn't save them. The longest cinematic dwelling, however, is the 25 seconds that viewers watch the ethereal white dress afloat in the sea. Delicate and light in a way that seems too perfect for this world, the image is arresting. Plunging viewers into the life world of the would-be wearer, we are invited to ask, what were her dreams of things to come? What did she imagine on the horizon, on the other side of the shore? Importantly, Juana's visual sensibility refuses to represent dead bodies lost at sea. Instead, their loss of life is visualized only through their personal effects. This then is the grammar of the video's memorializing project. 10 minutes and 47 seconds into the video, the sound of people can be heard in Spanish, in English, and laughter. Viewers are privy to hearing a world where beachgoers are unaware of the day's history where many people lost their lives in attempt to seek refuge on this side of the shore. It is a history that litters the beachscape, but is missed as people go about their everyday lives. What we do know is that waves wash debris ashore, and the sanitation workers will clean the beach by morning, erasing all the material personal effects that would leave visible evidence of these bodies lost at sea. Their bodies remain nonetheless, living sediments on the ocean floor, linking these passages to earlier Middle and other Atlantic passages. With Rest Ashore, Juana joins other Black Miami artists such as Terrell Alvin McCraney, Farron Humes, and Rachel Sanav, whose work deploy a Black hemispheric imaginary to accentuate the local manifestations of colonial legacies, multiple imperial entanglements, and the material and affective impact on bodies made subaltern. It is a daring, timely, and evocative installation that will elicit necessary public discussions, local, national, and transnational, in this global climate of anti-immigrant sentiments and racial reckoning. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Donette. And our next presenter, Arlene Dávila, are you ready to go? I think you are, there you go.
Okay, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Excellent. Thank you. I want to start by thanking Monica, Locust Projects, and the esteemed colleagues that are part of the ecosystem, indeed, Donette, and María Elena, and most of all, Juana, for producing such politically important work that always makes us think about timeless and crucial issues. And I too will read to stay on time, except that unlike my colleagues, I will not have images. So please bear with me, I will be fast. So issues of racial politics involving the flow of movements of peoples across the globe have been consistently central to Juana's work. And while in this case, the installation focuses on Cuban balseros, I want to speak about how it also speaks to broader concerns about the very rights and humanity of all refugees. The work had me thinking about the 35th anniversary of Justice Thurgood Marshall's famous groundbreaking dissent in Jane versus Nelson, which we're commemorating at NYU Law School later this week, that is co-sponsored by the Latinx Project. And it was great to see that Donette already mentioned this landmark case, which was brought about on behalf of Haitian refugees who, upon risking their lives to flee the Duvalier regime in the 1980s, encounter a hostile and discriminatory system of uncertainty and long detentions. This lawsuit became one of the first to allege and expose racism in the federal government. And while race was not found to be the final determining factor in the ruling, Marshall's dissent remains a historical landmark in the fight for equal protection of Haitian immigrants and the halting of discrimination of immigrants on the basis of race and nationality. Today, when this administration's immigration policy has been characterized by racist distinctions between migrants who come from shithole countries and those from imaginary Scandinavian ones, and when we have become almost numbed to images of Central American children in cages, the extent to which race shapes understandings of humanity and of who is entitled to protection and rights and who is considered disposable are more pressing than ever, as is also Juana's work. Juana's work confronts us with the racial politics of immigration and the racial politics of Latinidad by exploring issues of borders, colorism, and the imperial logics shaping how peoples and identities are hierarchically ranked and valued. And this has been the subject of our conversations that Juana alluded to for a couple of years now. Through Juana's work, we are alerted to the reality that relational hierarchies across peoples, cultures, commodities are not accidental, but are the products of empire and history. Juana carves these stories into her beautiful ceramic works and narrative-filled installations and prints, depicting the materiality of conquest and power, globalization, and movement, and the contradictory pleasures of capitalism. And I noticed that Juana included among the objects that are floating gold slippers, soccer balls, teddy bears, the doll, pink shoes, all materials that kind of hint to a world of aspiration and dreams. And I was hoping that Juana in the Q&A can tell us about that selection of objects too. Yet Juana wanted me to address issues of race among Latinx, kind of as a counter to also Donette's conversation and how it impacts the differential treatment and evaluation of refugees, issues that are nowhere more evident than when we're thinking about Latinx immigrants, not only to think about Juana's work in relationship to a Black hemispheric Miami, but also a new Latinx movement that also has space in Miami and elsewhere. Now, I want to think about how these logics about the differential treatment of immigrants have been so central to the ways in which we should be thinking about Latinx immigration, not only in regards to the different treatment of Latinx immigrants from European once and present, and here I'm purposefully challenging the historical view of many who seek to equate Latinx with the next Italian or Irish Americans, because this rosy version of assimilation ignores that Latinx history predates European immigration, and that unlike European migrants, Latinx immigration was racialized from the start by the long history of US colonization, conquest, and empire across the hemisphere. Yet race is also at the heart of the diverse experiences of immigration faced by different Latinx subgroups. And here we've already talked about the differential treatment of Haitians and Cubans, but also Cuban migrants themselves on the basis of race and class. You know, Juana's work does not allow us to take refuge or exception from confronting the reality that US borders and shores, and specifically for this work, Miami, and also the Miami version of Latinidad, has also been embroiled in multiple racist projects. And I'm thinking here of the ways in which Miami has long served as the so-called Latin Hollywood, the global creative media center, where dominant representations of Latinidad have been produced for decades now, since the Spanish language media industries began to ship productions to the United States in the 1990s. This involved recreating exactly this multicultural Creole whiteness that Donette is talking about. This vision of a nation within a nation, creating a Latin American nation within the context of the United States that speaks Spanish, and that would project and confirm the traditional values of conservatism, family-centeredness, and brand loyalty that marketers celebrated Hispanics for. Let's remember that Miami has also been a key space for Hispanic marketing and for most of the Hispanic advertising agencies. Now, by now, we're fully aware of how problematic this dominant Latin look formula has been in entirely erasing Black and Indigenous Latinx from most so-called Hispanic media representations. In fact, this whitewashed, sanitized vision of Latinidad has operated akin to how mestizaje has worked across Latin America to create myths of unity while erasing Blackness and indigeneity. Now, this is why Juana's voice and her work rooted in Miami provides such an important antidote to this dominant Latino formula, and why I wanted to write about her in my book on Latinx art, as an example of what I found most fascinating about a new generation of artists working alongside a growing Latinx art movement, especially when you think about the work that these artists are doing, but not only artists, scholars, María Elena is one of them, activists, so many new generations of creatives that are centering multi-diverse identities and more specifically foregrounding Black and Brown Latinx identities that have been most historically marginalized. Now, as someone who's been studying Latinx studies for 20 years, this is the development I find most exciting and promising. especially when you consider what it represents in regards to previous Latinx projects of the past, such as the Hispanic marketing formula that I already described and that Donette described so beautifully as this kind of multicultural Creole Latinx white project of whiteness. But also when you think about the moment today in relationship to the Latino projects of the 90s. At that moment, what you saw was how the politicization of Latino identities through social movements in direct challenge to the top-down Hispanic project of the 80s became similarly co-opted in what I elsewhere term a politics of Latino spin, of sanitizing Latinos for mainstream acceptance and public consumption. Now, today, generations of Latinx are embracing the X to project more inclusive definitions of identities, not only in regards to non-binary identifications, but also most specifically along racial and ethnic and even linguistic lines, to halt the whitewashing of Latino projects while aligning Latinx with larger movements of relational politics of solidarity and anti-racism. Now, this development fills me with great joy. And while I'm not naive and know that Latinx and any other label is as equally able to be co-opted and sanitized as previous projects of the past, that's exactly what's exciting, is to imagine that this relational politics have to do with larger movements and have to do with relational politics that change. But what I do know and what I do trust is that when Latinx no longer has the bite that makes people think twice about who's included and who's not, and it no longer helps us to call attention to those marginalized multiverse identities that need to be front and centered, I do trust that it'll be artists who will be the first to adopt new labels, definitions, and also the first to embrace new social movements that do. And among them, I'm sure that it will be creative forces like Juana Valdes, who will be at the forefront and leading the way. I look forward to joining the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Arlene. And what a perfect segue into our next presenter, María Elena Ortiz, who's the curator at PAM, and will talk to us a little bit more about Juana's exhibition and all these ideas that are starting to come up in the context of art. Give me 1 second to share my screen, María Elena.
Yes, of course. Thank you, Monica, for putting everything together. And of course, thank you to my esteemed colleagues here. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Juana. And also thank you to the audience, because I see a lot of friends. So thank you for taking your Tuesday afternoon to join us in such a vivid conversation. So Juana, when we're talking about this, this program, she asked me, how does my work connects to the research that you've been doing in the Caribbean and with other artists? So my role here today is to really look at the aesthetics of the work and then connect them to other artists and just share with you how I'm seeing the work and very much how it connects to basic ideas, I think, or tropes in Caribbean contemporary art and even Latinx art. So in her work, Juana takes the sea, Juana takes the landscape to really speak about the complexities of migration. And this is very crucial because in a lot of ways, she's pushing against the stereotype of the sea as a place of leisure, as a place of pleasure, which here in Miami, we sell to tourists, and in the Caribbean, we sell even more to tourists as a means of subsistence. And she's presented it not as a paradise or pleasure, but rather as a place of contest, as a place in which at times it can become a place of death. So it is quite interesting that if we move now to the next slide, one of the final slides in Juana's video is actually an image of the horizon line, which is very much reminiscent to this Juan Capote work, Island, in which he, like Juana, he's Cuban, and he really much concentrates on the beauty of the landscape of the sea, to in a sense how as an island, the sea also becomes this place of pain, especially when you think about migration and when you think about what it means to leave a place to go to another, and how often people lose their lives in this site. And if you move to the next slide, you see how Capote, like Juana, tries to create this place of contestment by creating the sea with different fish hooks that very much, if you think as your body kind of pushing yourself against this fish hooks, it's a it's a site of pain. And in a lot of ways, Juana's work is also addressing the sea as this almost this burial, this place of transition that is very unknown, sure, full of hope, but still full of pain. Now, if we move to the next slide, this idea of how landscape, again, trying to demystify it, you also see it in the work of Bahamian Arian Blue Curry, who did this conceptual approach during the Jamaica biennial in 2014, in which he took different postcard images of beaches in Jamaica, and then created big photographs that are then, printed on top of buildings that are in decay in Kingston. Again, trying to say how this image of this idyllic landscape is actually a misconstrued image for the consumption of others that does not portray the complexities of the space, as you see in Juana's work. Now, if we move to the next image, I also wanted to share this other work by Joy Minaya, who, like Juana, she was born in the Dominican Republic and migrated to the US. So she has a similar biography in terms of somebody that comes from the Caribbean, from a Latin origin. And then it's also using ideas of landscape and to question colonization and to question the complexities of the global moment. This is actually a project that she did here in Miami, in which she printed this beautiful fabric that pertains to, images of exoticism in the Caribbean, to cover the monument that is right now here in Miami on the Biscayne Boulevard, Ponce de Leon, who, as some of you know, Ponce de Leon was a big, colonizer. He killed a bunch of natives, and perhaps a very contested, a very contested image in Latin history that is canonized right now in Biscayne Boulevard, which kind of points to, ideas of this white Creolization moment of the 80s. So it would be interesting to see when this sculpture was originally put on in comparison to the history Donette and Arlene are very much sharing with us. Now, if we move to the next image, Juana's work, I think that also points to how in Caribbean identity or identities of transition, like Latinx identities, migration, it's something that is intricate to that experience. And what I mean by that even if you stay in a country of origin, let's say Puerto Rico, where I'm from, or in or where you're back, wherever you're in Latin America and so on, you have an experience of migration. What I mean by that is that perhaps your aunt is in New York, your cousin is in California. So even if you don't physically migrate, there is this aspect about migration that we still experience. And it really also speaks to just how the movement of bodies have been so important to the globalized economy. And here we can live in this country and have all this wealth and so on, but there's other countries like in the Caribbean, like in parts of Latin America, which their job has been to push people out and just sell bodies to come and work here, for example. And those types of very very deep and very intimate conversations about the experience of migration is something that you also see in other artists that are also of Caribbean descent in the diaspora here in the United States, like the next slide, which is a work by Cosmo Whitey. He's an artist that was born in Jamaica who had to immigrate. And he also takes on, in this case, an installation to present his own rendition of what migration is. So he takes this airplane seats, covers them with a cloth, which is cover itself with plastic. And I think a lot of us in this room can relate to seeing an image which having your grandmother's house of tablecloth covered in plastic. And then on the bottom, there's a lot of shattered plate. So there's an allusion here to the domestic space, but also how when you migrate, there's a part of your identity that's being shattered and transformed, that you still keep the longing for that place of origin, but there's still a transformation. And I think that this is also interesting in this conversation because, for us in Miami, and of course, with Juana's biography, we think about the sea as the place of migration, right? Or the vehicle, but actually most migration is done by planes. And it also Juana's approach also gestures very much to the regionalism of her approach, and in terms of situating it in a Caribbean Miami environment. Now, if we move to the next slide, I also wanted to, kind of also for us to think about a lot about this idea of how her body addresses borders, and very much thinking about other Latinx artists that are also thinking about borders and water, but also in connection to bigger conversations about a global migration. This is a work by Ana Teresa Fernandez, who, like Juana, she's originally from Mexico, moved here to work California, but she was also inspired by the Mediterranean. And that's something that in Juana's work, she's also trying to gesture, and it's how this experience of migration is not only common to our area, but also to the Mediterranean. And it's interesting how both artists, again, with transitory identities, migrants' experiences, try to connect and try to share their experiences to wider issues of globalization in the current times. So like Juana, here Ana Teresa actually did an action where she tried to drown herself in the water to try to create this performative action that speaks to the act of drowning in the sea, in the Mediterranean Sea. And in some of the scenes of Juana, especially like in the middle end of the show, of the video, you feel that experience of almost drowning or holding your breath, which I think that she does very poetically, and very, again, speaks to this idea of the sea as a place of death and so on. So if we move to the next slide. And then, again, when we think about, in Juana's last slide, where you see the shoreline and you see all the clothes on the beach, you almost feel like these are bodies that are almost commodified, and certainly for consumption. And that scene also reminded me of this other Latinx artist, Julio Cesar Morales, who, addressing the current migration of the US-Mexico border, he started to make these watercolors of undocumented immigrants kind of trapped in this piñata types of objects, to think about the commodification and the traffic of bodies in the border. And I think that if, now moving to the next slide, when you see this image here, I think there's also very powerful, because you think about economics and you also think about race. Same when you look at the things that are floating in the water. Like when you see the backpack, I think, who could own this backpack? Who could own this clothes? These are not high-end Louis Vuitton type of brand names. These are just regular clothes that could be from anybody. So certainly you get into this idea of class, of who migrates and how they're migrating here, but also race, because I think that, especially when you think about mainstream media, you're always thinking about this stereotypical image of a migrant. And certainly those images are also, a subtitle of what is happening. Image that, once again, you construct this very exotic idea of the sea and of the beach side to, prevalentize it and really complicate what we're viewing. So that's the end of my intervention here. I guess I'll pass it on to Monica before we go into the Q&A section. And thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much. And Juana, I'm so struck by all the intersections that that come together through your work, and all the various kind of avenues of conversation that we can have. In one sense, your work, explores a multitude of experiences of migration across time, but it also speaks so much to our current moment. And as Arlene mentioned, I think at the end of her presentation, the current racial reckonings that are a big topic of conversation right now. So I'm so struck by that just how many interesting and intersecting topics across time come out of your work, but also that just feel so urgent and so relevant right now. So I'm gonna kick things off with our first question in the Q&A window. And if anybody else has questions, by all means, please go ahead and drop them in the Q&A. And as promised, we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. The first question is for Juana directly. I'm wondering, this is from Shauna McDonald. I'm wondering if you can discuss what the narrative form of film video offered your concept that still images and analog objects did not, or was video employed in this project because you felt it couldn't be made in any other way? So I think that question speaks to kind of this experimentation with video that I think is fairly new for you, and why it was so important to communicate this project in that way.
Thank you. And thank you, Shona, for being there. And so she's a colleague. So I appreciate her taking the time to be here with us today. So the project and the decision to work with video for me was really an immediate one. It came in two ways. It came because I was seeing in 2015 a lot of the images that the media was portraying of a lot of the Syrian refugees, and it created this sort of double trauma. It reminded me and took me back to the images of El Mariel and later on the images of the Barcero. And I realized that what I really wanted to do and why I wanted to work with video was I wanted to intercede in that imagery that was existing in the media. And so that the video and the moving image became one way in which I could intercede in that particular media that perhaps painting or sculpture could not. It would be something that would be also exhibited or seen in the same format as these images that were coming across. And so that was my main reason for working in video. But also I felt that it gave me the opportunity to create a larger narrative than I could have done in a still image.
Thank you, Juana. There's another question here by María Elena Angulo saying, Juana, could you please expand on your reference to commerce at the beginning of the presentation?
What I was thinking in terms of commerce, and I think the palettes really addressed that component in the exhibition. Globalization is tied to the history of trade, right? And that history of trade is built on the history of empire and colonization. It's impossible to separate them. If you go back to the beginning of the sort of the East Indian Company in Holland and the East Indian Company in England, these which are the first two corporations ever were specifically established to deal with trade. But not only did they did that, they also had armies, they had boats, and they acted as a political agency as well. For me, that history, it ties in to the idea of immigration and to the idea of commerce, because it has created a global world in which we could refer to as the South and the North, but in which one group of people is producing, materials are being extracted from specific countries, and those commodities are being made, but are being experienced and enjoyed by a different group. And so that's part of what I was talking about when I began the presentation.
Yes, great. I wanted to address another question that was placed in the chat that basically says that Juana provides a perfect example because of her exhibitions and all of the renown she's received in Miami and New York, that she may be an example that if there's sincerity in one's practice and academic excellence, racism does not exist, and that maybe Juan is an example of success and respect in the difficult art world. And I want to address that because part of what I just did in Latinx art in my book was interview artists, right, at all levels. And I had the opportunity to address this issue in my interviews with those artists, Latinx artists that have made it, right, that has supposedly made it. And what I found was that racism was very much central to their practice and it affected how they were seen, oftentimes as exceptions, right? So there was always a rhetoric or a narrative around, well, they're just unique, like they're not really Latinx, right? There seemed to be this inverse relationship that the more that they made it, that the less likely they were like the rest of us. That there is, and there were many examples, like it could be some of the most renowned artists that, may get an exhibition but are not collected, right? Or there's this politics of overcompensation that a lot of our artists that supposedly are successful have had to do in terms of what's expected for them to do over and above to achieve this similar or a level of notoriety and success. So I just want to, the person that asked the question, to be very aware that racism sadly affects our community of artists of color at all levels, and those that are at the highest and pinnacle oftentimes have had to are perhaps the most examples, not of the sincerity or that if they work they make it, right? But oftentimes of the larger structures that were placed in our community to be recognized. And I want to highlight that I don't think in the case of Juana is one of the artists that I feel, compared to others, should be getting a lot more recognition. Juana should be in museums, collected in major museums, and I don't think your work is as collected as it should be. Juana's work should be taught in schools, and I don't think it is. Very few people know about Juana's work, and one of the reasons why I wrote about Juana was especially for that reason. So I think that it's a great question, but it's one that is very nuanced, and I think that you know, I'm a fan of Juana, and I think we should know more about her work.
Thank you, Arlene, because I agree 110%, because I think that success is not an exhibition at local. Success in our artistic practice is measured in a lot of different ways. And we should not get confused with the marketing of things, because, you know, it goes back more to, collection, studied, and all this other stuff that makes the industry of an artist way more complex than just an exhibition. There is another question here by Oscar Reveling. He's saying the title of the main video installation, Rest Ashore, seems to further emphasize the ongoing nature of the migratory journey, even upon reaching the proverbial shore. In parallel with the strife experience across the bodies of water, what are some of the redemptive and perhaps healing qualities one may access across these sites, ones imbued with both trauma but also promise?
That's a question for who?
You know, I think it doesn't say for who, so I think anybody who wants to tackle it can go ahead.
I think he's trying to get at you cut out a little bit, María Elena. I don't know if it was just for me or everyone while you were asking the question. So I think what he's trying to get at is that, you know, that there is this feeling of strife and trauma, but can there also be redemptive and healing qualities and maybe some promise? And can you speak to that, the other side of that coin a little bit?
Go ahead, Donette. I'm thinking.
I can take that if you want.
Yes. Anyone can jump in and take it right. It's your show.
So I don't think that the two are mutually exclusive, right? To think about, on the one hand, what it means continually as immigrants to risk it all to take this sea journey, right? And so, yes, there is the trauma. And I think that on the one hand, what I find so provocative about Juana's piece is that it's so beautiful, right? And yet it's careful not to romanticize, right? So I think she wants for us to think about, we want to hold together the hope and the dreams that compel people to migrate, but at the same time hold on to the trauma of loss, the trauma of death, right? And it does, and what's so important about the sort of futurity of this Rest Ashore is that you know that in spite of the bodies lost at sea, there will be other migrants that will risk it all again, right? So there's a way in which it's a circular process. And that to me is what's so interesting about the fact that she decides to make it a one day, well, to shoot the beginning and the end of a day, because we can imagine that the very next day, this cycle will continue. So that there's something very regenerative about the process, but I think that she wants us to hold on to the two things simultaneously, right? Like to walk away from the trauma and just think about the optimism doesn't capture sort of the complexity of what the video is trying to communicate.
I mean, I just want to add that the video actually on purposely ends like that. The last image that you see, which is again this movement in the water, is the motor starting all over again, right? And so the even as it ends in this kind of what might look like a catastrophe of loss of life, there's a whole new group of people who are about to undergo and take the journey again for the possibility. And I feel for me the hopes and that the redemption comes in the desire for that better place, the better part of well-being, that is carried within the individual. I think that anyone that does have to go through this experience or any experience of migration that creates a certain amount of trauma, that trauma stays there, and part of that experience of coming out of that is learning to negotiate that trauma, and in a way that doesn't hinder what a better life could be, or the possibility of arriving at a better place. Hopefully that answered the question in some way for me.
We received a lot of more questions. One is from Frosier Alvarado, and for you, Juana, I love how you have addressed water and the sea in so many of your works. It is clearly such a crucial theme, and the title makes that connection so brilliantly. I love that Donette touched on it, but can you also comment a little bit more on the title and how you came to choose it?
I mean, it's interesting because we did not share this information, and we did not discuss the double intent and the name between me and Donette, but she arrived at the exact intention that I had with the title, right? And there was a moment in time where I fluctuated between the Rest Ashore and Rest Ashore as a way of maybe not being so kind of didactic in the title, in choosing the title, but then decided to go and stick to the idea of the reference of the shore and the shoreline, instead of the idea of feeling secure or safe, right? Because making it to the shoreline did grant that other person the ability to feel safe and secure. The title for me, I wanted something that, I don't know, the shore as a contested space. That's what I really wanted the title to do, and to bring everybody back to the shore as a border, and as a place again of joy, but also as a place of trauma and the significance that it has, especially for a person who does come from an island, right? That's always going to be there.
Oh.
We have two questions that are related. One is, Juana, how do you think it's important to create art that focuses on the plight of balseros? How does your work dialogue with that of artists who are dealing with other maritime unauthorized migrations in the Caribbean, for instance, that of Cheresade Garcia?
So the work begins, in the first part of the exhibition begins addressing the history of the Cuban migration. And I spoke when I originally, I said, I'm a very ambitious artist, I guess. When I first proposed this project, I thought, I will deal with the Cuban and the Haitian and really try to address the whole Creole situation that was happening in Miami. And as I started to do the research, I realized that I really couldn't do that it was almost an impossibility, or it would be a life's project. And so I pulled back and I focused primarily on the Cuban experience. And I didn't want to just leave it primarily to the idea of Balsero. I think one of the things that you will see in the video that really separates it from that, and that is the starting point, not just the Balsero, because Cubans have been coming in boats, on all types of boat. If we look at a Mariel and the amount of Cubans that came during a Mariel on the shrimp boats, and regular passenger boats, and all kinds of boats that went to Cuba to bring back families. I wanted, most Cubans when they leave don't really bring any materials, don't have any items. So the video really is actually tapping into a lot of the images I saw of the things that were being left behind by the Syrian refugee in Europe, right? And also also the caravans that were coming up from Central America. And so that the selection for the clothing in that in those items really comes out of a combination of those two sort of groups of people migrating.
Okay, so thank you, Juana. There's two more questions. One, I'll read them both. And before we close the session, one is, on another note, Juana, I'm interested in how you see your work in conversations with that of other Black and or immigrant artists, particularly Miami-based. Any specific names? And then I have another question saying, Juana, the representation of bureaucracy in the entry threshold to the exhibition is a powerful risk you take, given that a text-based political timeline against a video installation is rarely seen, even in museum scale shows. How do you reconcile the desire to engage in direct political action with the art world requirement for beauty? In the context of the election, Miami Cubanos for Trump, is there an aspect of Miami's unique identity that veil politics in a way New York City art world / media ignore?
Wow, that's is that just for me?
I think that Arlene or Donette can also can certainly address that. But the first one was a Miami-based artist.
So for I mean, this is a statement that I said once before at a similar panel. For me, it's impossible to separate my Blackness from my Cubanness, from my Americanness. Of growing up in the United States. So it's all combined and put together. I find it that the way that I work, and this is a very specific thing that I realize about myself now, is that I work, if I was a writer, I would write in the third person. I will never be that artist that is going to make them the direct marks on the wall. You know, I'm never going to be that I in that way. So I have the way that the presentation of the history of the policies that I have abated Cuban migration in the United States is in conjunction with the research of the data and the significance of the, I think we understand now what data really means and the importance of having the data. So to have the relationship of the policies up against the data that is being pulled on all Hispanics and Latinos in the United States, by specifically there of Cubans by the Pew Foundation, and then the television is to actually make us to think about how that data is also fueling the information that is being sort of brought through the televisions and now more currently in social media, and that all of these things are interconnected in the way that we experience them and record them in our memory. Even if different entities are pulling it apart and using it for different purposes. I'm going to let the panelists answer the second half of that question.
I guess I want to say that what's so fascinating about Juana is that she's one artist that is very much Miami based, but she's also very much New York based. Yeah. And she's also very international, hemispheric, and very aligned with both Black hemispheric communities, but with Latinx hemispheric communities, you know, from being part of the conversations around US Latinx futures. So I think that what's generative is, and this is something that you've said, Juana, is that you may not be doing the kind of work you're doing if you had not had the experiences you've had, right? Because there's also, I would say, more greater engagement with matters of race, multi-diverse identities in the context of Latinidad. I think the Latinx as a movement is perhaps one that has been more advanced or more spearheaded by the New York scene, I would say, or Los Angeles, more than Miami. I myself, you know, we've had these conversations that when you organize the Latinx Futures conversations in the Pérez Museum in Miami, right? There seemed to be kind of a disjunction in terms, but yet what I see you doing is kind of serving as a bridge, right, for conversations that go beyond the context of Miami and that need to be had, and that are very exciting, and you're kind of leading the way for breaking the kind of authenticating debates that have tended to, Black art, Cuban art, Miami art, Latinx art, that are, we need to be having larger conversations, and that's exactly what you're having us do.
I mean, before they shut us down, I have to say that on a personal level, and I think this is a decision that all artists make, is like, what am I going to make, right? And for me, it became really significant at a particular period in my time that the work that I would make, and it doesn't apply to any other artist. I think all artists choose this individually. Was it for me? It was important that my work carry a social message, and that the message spoke to my own personal history and how that history crossed over other aspects and other racial and gender issues as well. And one of the things that when my family first came to the United States, so you imagine we arrived in 1971, and you know, right after segregation is made illegal, and we still couldn't find a house to rent in some neighborhoods that were still predominantly white neighborhoods. So my family, I mean, my parents couldn't understand why they just couldn't rent wherever they wanted to rent, right? And so we were always never necessarily within that predominantly white Cuban community, but we were renting within other communities that included Puerto Ricans, that included people from Jamaica, from Santo Domingo. And it was that, I believe, has also informed the way in which I look at my community. While I'm a part of it, I also have this other aspect where I can sort of have a distance to it, and look at it, to see how it functions, and how it performs, I think, which is more important.
And I think I just want to add one quick thing, is that I think it's important to situate Juana generationally. And so, and what institutions were available to her or available or not available to her in Miami, and then how then New York becomes a space, right? So so there's a way in which she's the perpetual outsider because of race in Miami, right? And while New World School of the Arts becomes an institution, an organization, or institution in a school that's able to really shape the future of a lot of the generation of artists that come after her, that's not available to her, right? So it's important then that it is New York that she goes to, right? And I also think the other point that I think is important to not lose track of when we try to think about the ways in which she shows up as exceptional is that, in fact, I remember being at one of the panels hosted at the Pérez, and Juana was the only Black woman on the panel. Well, she's the only Black person on the panel, period. It was the one when they had the Cubans, the artists from Cuba meeting their American counterparts. She was the only Black person, she was the only woman, and that you see that the trajectory that people had inside Cuba would not have been hers, and the trajectory that her compatriots on this side of the shore had was also not hers, right? So that has everything to do with the difficulty of race and generation and gender. And so I don't want us to walk away thinking that somehow because now she has arrived at Amherst, and because now she is being collected in the ways that she is, that this journey hasn't been quite challenging, right? And that challenge has everything to do with the moment that she comes and the body that she inhabits.
I wanted to clarify that, the panel that you mentioned, Donette, was on an exhibition on contemporary Cuban art. So it was a very exclusive moment at panel. We're looking at contemporary art practices from Cuba. And I also wanted to mention that, like we were all saying, Juana's work presents that the Latinx identity is not a monolith. We all there's a very diverse community with different interests. So it is not uncommon to have Latinos for Trump. There's a lot of different people here with different interests, which I think it's important for us as a community to really start grasping upon the fact that all of us have different access to privilege, which is something that in the timeline, which we did not talk about in depth today, that you certainly point to about the access that the different layers of Cuban immigration had to the US in comparison to other groups. So I guess with that in mind, I guess I pass it to Monica.
Yeah, unfortunately, I mean, I feel like we could talk about this for hours, but unfortunately we are out of time. We're over time, so we do have to wrap things up. I just want to thank each of you again for your time and the care that you put into this program. I could feel that it was really more than just another program for you, that you were really invested in everything that we talked about today, and in, bringing a lot of interesting ideas out of Juana's work and supporting Juana. For all the guests who joined us today, thank you so much for your time. And you've heard a lot about Juana's show. Hopefully many of you have seen it already, but if you haven't, it is still on view at Locust Projects by appointment only until Saturday, October 24th. So go to our website, locustprojects.org, and make your appointment. And yeah, I guess that's a wrap. Thank you all again. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All of you. I'm like blown away by your contribution. So thank you so much for your time and effort and for being here. And may we do this again sometime soon, somewhere else.
Please.
In person.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.
Okay, Monica,
Bye-bye.
thank you.
Great.
I'll keep emailing you. That's
Please, you know where to find me.
Take care.